Welcome back. So, I hope that you studied the last lecture really well so that you really understood what we did there with our food processor function. Now, in JavaScript, there are different ways of writing functions, and each type of function works in a slightly different way. But don't worry, they are still all very similar. So, let's find out now. So, the functions that I showed you in the last lecture are called function declarations, because we simply use the function keyword to declare a function, a bit like we declare a variable. So let's now write another function declaration, and this time a function to calculate an age based on a given birth year. So let's again use the function keyword, and we're going to call this one calc age1, and that's because we're going to have another one later. So as I said, we want the person's birth year as an input to this function. And what is an input? Well, it's just a parameter in this function. And a parameter, remember, is a bit like a local variable that's only available inside of this function. Then the function body with the curly braces, and now the code that we want to create here. So, how do we calculate an age? Well, just like we did before, we take the current year, which once more, let's suppose it's 2037, and then minus the person's birth year. And then remember to take this value now out of the function, we return it using the return keyword. So we calculate the age first, and then we return that value. And actually we can simplify this and basically return all in one go. So there's actually no need to store this value here in a variable if all we do is then later return that value. So in fact, we can just take this value here, get rid of this, and then simply return the result of this expression here. So basically of this operation. Okay? So we're taking the birth year that we're going to receive and then use that to calculate the age. And so once again, this is a generic function which is then going to work for any birth year that we give it. So of course, let's now call or invoke or execute this function. And again, I can use all of these three words interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. So calc age1, and then remember to call the function, we use parentheses, and then we specify the actual value of the parameter, which is called the argument. Remember? So let's say 1991. Now some people use the words arguments and parameters as if they were the same, and actually that's not a big deal, but to be really precise, the parameter is, again, the kind of placeholder in the function, and the argument is then the actual value that we use to fill in that placeholder that is the parameter. Anyway, this will now create a value, right? And the value that this will create is the value that's returned from the calc age function. So basically this returned value. And so, once again, we need to capture or to save that value into a variable. So let's call this one age1. And just to make sure that it works, let's quickly check it out in the console. Okay. And indeed, we get 46, just like we did before. Okay. So that is a function declaration. But now let's create a function expression. So that's the other type of function that exists, and it looks like this. Instead of writing a function with the calc age name, we simply write function basically without a name, and then we still define the parameter. We still define the function body, which is going to be the same as this one, because we want another calc age function here. So we write the function like this, and then what we have to do is to store all of this here into a variable. And that variable will then be the function. So let's call it calc age h2. So again, we did write the function in a very similar way, but we didn't give it a name here. So it's a function without a name, basically, which is also called an anonymous function. So all of this here is basically an expression. And remember that an expression produces a value. And so we use that value and store it into calc h2. And this will then be the function. And I know that sounds very confusing, but it will make sense, trust me. Now, to call this function, we actually do it in the exact same way. So let's do h2 equals calc h2, and let's use 1991 again. And then let's grab this console.log here and log both the ages. So h2 here. Let's also add some comments here. Function declaration and function expression. And so we should get twice the 46 value here. And yes, indeed. So the function expression works the exact same way as the function declaration. So we call it in the same way, we capture the returned value in the same way, and then of course the result is also the same because the function body is the same. But it's very important to know that we have these two types of functions in JavaScript, because in some places we will actually need to write them like this, as you will see as we go through the course. So again, this part here that I just highlighted, this function here is in fact an expression. And remember that expressions produce values. And so we just assign this whole value here then to this variable. And so this variable will then hold this function value basically. And one big implication of what I just said, so that this here is just a value, is that in fact in JavaScript, functions are actually just values. So just as a number or a string or a Boolean value. So a function is not a type, okay? It's not like a string or a number type, but it's also a value. And so if it's a value, we can store it in a variable. So just keep this in mind because it will become very important later when we really dig deep into functions. Now, besides these technical differences, you might be wondering, what is the big deal? So what's the big difference between function declarations and function expressions? Well, the main practical difference is that we can actually call function declarations before they are defined in the code. So let me show that to you. So here is the declaration, right? This is the function declaration. And as I just said, we can call them in the code before they are defined. So now we're calling it first and then defining it later. So let me show you that that still works. And indeed, we still get the same result. But if we attempt to do the same with the expression, then that should not work. So let's see. And so cannot access calc h2 before initialization. Okay. And internally, this happens because of a process called hoisting, but more about that in a future section. Okay. For now, just keep in mind that you can call a function declaration before you define it, even though that might not be such a good idea in many cases. But you can do it if necessary. All right. Now, another question that you might have in your mind is, which of the two types of functions should I use when I write my own functions? And, well, the answer is that oftentimes it's really just a matter of personal preference. And so different developers prefer different formats. Personally, I prefer to use function expressions because this then forces me into a nice structure where I have to define all the functions first at the top of the code, and only then I can call them. So this makes the code a little bit nicer and more structured. I also like to have everything stored in variables, so both values and functions. But again, that is just my own personal preference, and many other developers don't agree with this and prefer to use function declarations. So if you also prefer function declarations, that's fine. So just use declarations then. It's absolutely no problem. However, even if you prefer one over the other, you still need to know about both the function expressions and function declarations. So you cannot just pick one and then forget the other one, because both have their place in JavaScript. And so it's really important that you know how to use and how to distinguish both function declarations and expressions.